Okay.
We're back.
We're back. Tuesday talk.
So today we're going to be talking about whether it is beneficial to do a seller concession on a transaction or a price reduction in lieu of inspection negotiations or inspection repairs. So the example that we were just starting to dive into was, let's just say that the inspection reveals that the water heater is old and corroded. It's 15 years old. It needs to be replaced. And the radon levels are a little bit high. So we're looking at, probably $2,000 for a water heater, $1,000 for a radon mitigation system. And the buyer and the seller decide that it is probably going to be more beneficial to do a credit or a price reduction in lieu of trying to fix these items before closing. So the question becomes, is it better for the buyer to have a closing cost concession, or is it better just to reduce the sales price? So there's a couple things. Doing a closing cost concession is typically the buyer's favorite route because what it's going to do is it's going to directly affect the amount of money they have to bring to closing. So the buyer's going to have loan fees, prepaid items, hazard insurance, property taxes, escrows, HOAs, and they have to bring their down payment plus their closing costs. And if the seller gives them a $3,000 credit, that reduces the amount of money they have to bring, therefore leaving extra cash in their pocket to make those repairs after closing. Now, if you do a price reduction, you're going to do $3,000 off the purchase price. That's not going to put extra money in the buyer's pocket. That's just going to reduce their mortgage payment by this amount.
Yeah. So as we all know, the average sales price out there is $600,000.
Mm-hmm.
So you're buying the house for 600. We'll say that's what the loan amount is. Make it easy numbers. We'll bring that down to $597,000. That's really not going to change anything for the buyer. So definitely putting the money in the buyer's pocket is beneficial.
Because remember, a seller can't write a check to the buyer at closing. So it's not the seller saying, here's $3,000 to go make these repairs. It has to go on the settlement statement and be applied towards something.
And I'd like to repeat that one more time. The seller can't give the buyer a check at closing, after closing, anytime. There is no way around giving buyer funds that aren't on the settlement statement and aren't already notified to the lender.
Yeah.
Now, if there's no lender, if this is a cash transaction, none of this really applies.
It doesn't matter.
This is all if there's a loan on the property.
Yep.
So again, it has to be on the settlement statement. I get the phone call. Can't
do it.
Can't do it. Please watch this video. You can't do it.
Can the seller give the buyer gift cards to Home Depot in the amount of $3,000?
No.
Nope.
That is loan fraud. That is a federal offense. Federal. So it has to be on the settlement statement, and it's not a down payment. It has to go towards the non-recurring closing costs.
Yep. So that's your loan origination fee, your HOAs, your property taxes. It would be any administrative fees that the lender perhaps charges. So the important piece to this is when you're negotiating inspection items, the first thing you want to do is pick up the phone, call the lender, and say, how much are the buyer's closing costs? Because that amount could be $5,000, it could be $8,000. It depends on the purchase price and what fees that lender charges. Here's the scenario that comes up and where things get a little dicey. Roof needs to be replaced. It's a $12,000 roof. You guys negotiate all this stuff just fine, do an amend, extend. We're going to do, seller agrees to credit buyer $12,000 towards closing costs, prepaid items, and loan fees. Lender says, buyer only has $7,200 worth of closing costs. And you go, what do we do with the extra money? So it's important to know this information up front. That's when a price reduction comes in to play. Maybe you do a $7,200 closing cost concession, and then the remainder gets done in the form of a price reduction on the sales price to get you to that 12 grand.
So we're going to get the question. I want to get the roof done. What else could I do? What's another scenario other than I don't want to reduce the price?
Mm-hmm.
I can't get the money. How do we get that roof taken care of?
Have it done prior to closing.
have it done prior to closing. Have the seller take
Replace
care
the
of it, replace the roof. You really don't want to do things after closing. It's just so hard to follow up and make sure that things happen.
Not to mention the lender has to approve an escrow. If you're doing something as big as a roof, they have to escrow 1.5 times the amount of the bid. The seller's proceeds get pulled out. It's put in an escrow account. The lender has to approve it. Everybody has to follow up on it. The appraiser has to go back out and cross-check it and make sure things were done. Receipts have to be sent in. And then what if the buyer doesn't like the way it turned out? What if the seller says, well, I did exactly what you asked? What if they didn't pull permits? I mean, there's just a lot.
A can of worms. So what we're suggesting here is you have 2 scenarios: concessions.
Price reduction.
Price reduction. Yeah. Concessions or price reduction. So like Stacey said, the first thing to do is to talk with the lender, because oftentimes maybe the transaction already had seller was going to be paying for some closing costs. And you're like, oh, I totally forgot. They were already paying $3,000 towards closing costs. Maybe it was, a first-time home buyer in that $300,000 range where they needed some additional funds to help get to the closing table.
Yep.
And now we have inspection issues. We have no more money we can give them. The only solution is then to reduce the price of the property.
Yeah. And you can do a combination, kind of like we talked about. Maybe you do 5,000 in concessions and 5,000 in a price reduction. You can definitely do that. The problem is you have to be very, very careful with this, because if you don't specify in your contracts what happens if there is a surplus of funds, the buyer loses those funds and they go directly to the seller's pocket. Because if you can't utilize all of the closing costs and you don't specify what happens to that money, if you don't use it, you lose it.
So pre-plan, talk to the lender, and be careful about your timing. If you get too close to that closing and you find out that there's some monies left over that can't be utilized, and you're 3 days from closing, you would have to change all the documentation, refile with the lender, the new price change, and the seller doesn't have to agree to extend the closing. You're 3 days within.
Yeah,
So,
and there's so many things that have to change. The appraisal has to change when you modify the sales price. So really you have to do this mid-transaction, not a week before closing. There's just too many dominoes. Exactly. Let's see.
So what questions do we have?
If we have any questions.
I know Paul had questions about this even.
Yeah. And of course, if you're dealing with really small negotiation items, a home warranty, maybe the seller says, hey, I don't want to pick the home warranty. I'm going to give you money at closing and you can choose the home warranty company. We're talking $400. That's not usually something that's going to be a problem with the lender. But when we're talking thousands of dollars, that's when you really, really want to cross-check with the lender to make sure that you can do this.
But again, this is on the settlement statement.
Yes.
So when we make light of it's only $400, we don't mean it's only a $400 check that somebody's going to write later. We do mean that's on the settlement statement.
Exactly. I know one of the questions that had come up with, and I think we answered it, but I just want to circle back, is what's the threshold for concessions and how do you know? It's very property specific. It's price range specific. We can't say the threshold, the most you can ever ask is $7,000. It really depends on each buyer. And in order to know that, you call the lender. Paul says we answered all his questions. His question was, can't the seller write a check to the buyer? That comes up on the support line quite often.
Yeah.
So.
The question actually comes up, I know they can't write a check, so how can...
What's the way around it?
There is no way around it.
Yeah, exactly. So Beth says, you said funds need to be specified in the contract. Did I hear that right? So yes, everything should always be in writing.
Yeah.
It's going to be on an amend extend typically for closing cost concessions because the lender likes it separated from the inspection objection and inspection resolution. So anytime you're talking about doing a price reduction or seller concessions, you do that on an amend extend. Can the seller pay the roofer before closing if timing is short?
So pay them, but the job's not going to be done, is what we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So technically, yes. and no. It depends on what the lender is. If the lender knows that this roof has to be repaired, the lender's going to want this thing repaired. Now, occasionally, you might be able to get a receipt from the bill or from the roofer with extra funds in escrow in case that he runs into some issues. So
yeah, so the lender's worried about the fact that their collateral, the property, is not going to be in tip-top condition the way it's supposed to be. And what happens if the seller pays the roofer, that roofer isn't a reputable roofer, the roofer skips town or files bankruptcy or doesn't show up? Now you've got a house that doesn't have a roof and the lender is worried about that. So those are just kind of some of the nuances that you have to be concerned with.
They can sometimes be worked through.
Yeah.
That is not the best way to do it. And especially, you do not want to get involved with insurance company. We have had issues where the insurance company is going to pay for the roof. What if we get a letter from them? They'll take care of it. We have seen sellers take off with the insurance check. The roof never get taken care of. The best way to handle this is with a concession or price reduction.
Or just getting it done.
Or getting it done. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Done and inspected and good to go. And if you're representing the buyer, that is the best way to protect them. And I know people are in a hurry sometimes. People want to move, but doing it's smart for everyone.
Yeah, doing a 40 or 45-day close just to make sure that you can get that roofer out there, you can get the roof done, you can get it re-inspected, you can get the appraiser back out there, and you can get all the documentation so that the lender goes, we're good to go. If a repair cannot be completed before closing, funds should then be held in escrow to cover repairs after closing, correct? So yes, let's say you're a week before closing and the furnace is supposed to be replaced and the contractor says, I can't make it out there. I'm so very sorry. You call around, you do everything you possibly can to try and get that done, and it's just not going to happen. That's when buyer's agent has to phone the lender. Lender has to approve an escrow account because not all lenders approve escrow accounts. And so if the lender says, sure, we're fine with the seller taking some of their proceeds, escrowing it so that the repair can be done after closing and paid from that escrow funds, then you're fine doing that.
So it's a way to remedy a situation. Again, it's not guaranteed and it's not the best, but we can solve issues a lot of the time, but not all the time with an escrow. And they're going to ask for extra monies in the event that the guy goes out there to do a quick repair and finds out that there's more to it than they thought, than the original estimate was.
Right.
Who's going to pay for that extra? So that's why there's usually 1.5 times put into escrow, and that does always make the seller excited to put in extra
money.
50% in.
Yeah. And then you guys are not drafting escrow agreements. That's something that the title company does, because there's a lot of legalese in there on when do the funds get dispersed? Does the buyer have to approve the work before it's paid? Does the buyer have to say, yes, release the excess funds to the seller? How long can the money sit there? I mean, there's a lot of different things. So that's not something you guys are doing. That's something that the title company is doing in conjunction with the lender. What is your suggestion regarding home inspection where roofer cannot get the roof on due to snow? Request additional time for roof inspection? So yeah, we definitely see that come up. Whether you extend your inspection objection and resolution completely to allow for the roofer to get out there to visually inspect that, or you can actually negotiate all of your inspection items except for the roof and make it contingent upon an acceptable roof evaluation on or before X date. So if the buyer is going to want to ask for X, Y, and Z, you might as well negotiate that through with the seller now and then make it contingent also upon that roof evaluation coming in and that being the only outstanding item that you guys need to wrap up.
Yeah, and we see that on roofs and we see it on radon. Maybe at the last minute they forgot that they wanted a radon test and they don't get the results back before your inspection objections due. That's another typical reason why let's negotiate all this other stuff. In the event that comes up, we'll address that, within 4 days, but you can at least get started on the other things. So yeah, similar situation.
Yeah, the other situation that has cropped up occasionally is when you go in to do the inspection, you realize that there's potentially some structural issues and you have to have a structural engineer. Sometimes they're out a week to 10 days, but hey, if we can't get these items taken care of, we don't even want to move forward. So you can start negotiating the initial repair items subject to the structural engineer report coming back. So that's kind of another one that comes up.
Yeah, which is smart to protect. Again, this is protecting your buyer. Let's not keep spending money and having inspections if we find out that they're not willing to even do the basics. Well, there's no reason for us to go down the road to find out if there's a real issue if they're not willing to do any of the other things.
Yeah, exactly. Beth, so then as soon as I know there will be a concession and the lender, listing agent, buyer, seller all know about it, I write the amend or the listing agent. Sorry to beat a dead horse. So it doesn't matter who writes the amend. No. Listing agent, buyer's agent, it doesn't matter. Generally, I say whoever the amend benefits, that party should originate it. So if it's dealing with closing cost concession for the buyer, you as the buyer's agent might as well draft that up so you get the wording exactly the way you want it.
Main thing is don't let it hang out there. Get it buttoned up as soon as possible and communicate between you and the other agent. Hey, you want to write this up? Want me to write this up? If no one really is taking that stance.
Yeah. And if this is tied to inspection negotiations, make sure you get it all done by the inspection resolution deadline. Because if you guys are going back and forth trying to negotiate things and you don't get the amend drafted by the inspection resolution deadline, seller doesn't have to agree to anything.
Right.
Good question. I think that's all we have.
Wasn't a dead horse. It was a good question.
No, it was a great question. What about an example of a hailstorm during the contract phase? Oh, this is my least favorite scenario. You've nailed it. And after inspection. So both parties want to close on time, but the home needs a new roof. Do we need to write an amend, extend, get all parties involved, lenders, insurance, etc.? It's always a complicated one.
And the answer is yes, really. And not just hailstorm, anything that happens to the house. If there's a water leak,
basement flood,
anything that happens to the home from when the contract went under, they need to redo the property disclosure. You get the right to renegotiate these repairs because the home is supposed to come the way that you wrote the contract. So these issues need to be taken care of by the seller, and now you're dealing with insurance.
Yeah. So in the hail example, yes, seller has to get on the phone to the insurance company. They have to get the insurance adjuster out there. You have to figure out how long is it going to take to replace the roof? How much money are they allotting for that? When can the contractor get out there to do it? And most of the time we're looking at a closing date extension. And that's usually not what the buyer and the seller want to do, but it's really hard to get a roof replaced after closing when insurance is involved. And like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fraud that happens out there. There's a lot of little loopholes that you forget to negotiate and put in writing, and it puts the buyer at risk. Not necessarily the seller, it puts the buyer at risk. So
yeah, you got to get it done before closing. That's all there is to it.
Yep.
When you don't want to deal with insurance after the fact.
Yep.
It's the only DORA investigation in our office in the last 11 years and 15,000 some transactions that we lost on because an agent did do this improperly and didn't follow up and protect the buyer the right way with insurance, and the seller took the money and the roof never got taken care of. So we don't want that to happen.
Yep, exactly. So, all right.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Have a great week.
Take care. See ya.
Bye.